present the findings and the analysis. So I was brought into the group, but then asked by individual organizations to present to their staff, to their boards, sometimes to other organizations. One group asked me to come in and give a presentation to the ICRC because they had questions about how to interact with Israeli society. And even over the years, by the way, I've been asked to talk about these things. Others, about 5 of the 10 organizations have asked me to come back over the years just to hold sort of strategic brainstorming sessions, like for half a day or a day, sometimes even reconvening the whole group. And 3 of them have conducted, or one of them is about to conduct, further research on specific issues related to their organization and human rights stuff. And so I think I'll just end with showing you sort of a couple of examples of how they've used and implemented what I call internal and external. So external being, let's use the survey to grab a headline, get some attention to our issue, and internal being for our own purposes and strategizing. Oh, whoops, I'm using external. This is an organization that wanted to focus on a very, very specific question of just showing what Israelis know or don't know about a particular issue related to the conflict. It is actually a human rights issue, but it doesn't look like it right away. It has to do with how many settlers and how many Palestinians live in the Jordan Valley area. And we did the survey showing that, well, as they put on their website, how many Israelis, how much do you know about the Jordan Valley? Apparently not enough. That was what this organization sort of had a website page about it, and they gave the data, and it gave them an opportunity to show some of the actual facts about it. And the other thing that they did was get some press. So this is in Hebrew, you're not expected to read it, but I translated the key sentences. Big headline, 63.5% of Jews are wrong. The Jordan Valley, because they think the Jordan Valley is under Israeli sovereignty. The Jordan Valley is part of the West Bank, occupied territory, not under Israeli sovereignty. Of course, it is actually under military sovereignty, but Israelis don't want to admit that. I mean, so they're sort of right but wrong in a way. And then there's that sentence down there showing that 9.6% think that only Israelis live there, 34.5% think that mostly Israelis live there, and a few Palestinians. Just 17% know that the opposite is true. The point is, this is an opportunity for them to get some press attention and highlight the true situation of what's going on there. Okay, so that's a good, and that was, by the way, that wasn't part of our human rights survey. That was like one question in an omnibus that I did for a number of organizations. So it cost them very little to get this, and they really milked it and got quite a bit of press out of it. And then internal, this is just to give you a sense of how we analyzed what, the kind of product that we try to put together for them. So in terms of segmenting the population, we look at who the core, what we call the core or your base audiences are. And in our case, they really needed reinforcement. So sometimes you can say we have a core audience, we don't really need to pay too much attention to them because they're on our side anyway. That's not the case here. They really needed reinforcement. And that includes left-wingers, centrists, and even a very small portion of the right, which is what we found out from the quant. Okay, so it's good to always do qual and quant together. We wouldn't have really known that until we had done, big enough sample to look at the right wing. And then target groups, those who really need to be persuaded, or, that sounds kind of patronizing, but to really try to get them new information and ideas to open their minds. We found surprisingly a bit of a gender gap, which is not generally the case in Israel with relation to the conflict. We actually don't have much of a gender gap in public opinion. But in our survey, we found that men were sort of more resistant to human rights ideas. The theory that we built was that it's probably because of their idea of service. Actually they're the ones who are serving with, their interaction with Palestinians is really about the conflict. Russian-speaking immigrants from the former Soviet Union, absolutely the religious populations, we've been talking about this a lot, that the religious people in Israel are pretty much, the more religious you are, the more resistant you are to every idea that's either liberal, left-wing, certainly on the conflict, and also on issues of democracy and human rights, and young people. Because young people are increasingly, for the last 6 or 7 years, identified with the right, and along with that, the whole package of ideas. So this is, the kinds of segmenting they had to do, and then here are some of the sort of key recommendations, messages, actions. Again, this is just a sample of the kinds of stuff we came up with. That there are opportunities in the Israeli public, and they're not to be ignored. This, again, may sound intuitive, but it is absolutely not intuitive for the Israeli human rights organizations. Some of them still don't believe it. I think that they should be, making it a point to reach out. Each of them have to make their own decisions, and for some of them I can see the argument why they don't need to, but it's not worth neglecting them. One of the powerful messages was, to acknowledge the complexity and not make it all seem black and white and one-sided and sort of get away from this self-righteous, you need to be doing the right thing, and Israelis don't like to feel like they're being told to do the right thing, when the fact is that the conflict is quite complex. And human rights doesn't have to contradict the national identity. That was part of the messaging you saw before, being above politics. And then I think the one thing we also came up with, and again, I have lots more data on all of this here, so if anybody wants to focus on a particular point, come to me. But the idea about the security concerns is you can't just brush them off. Like, I was talking about this on the bus with you, I think. Like, you can't, you have to actually acknowledge the reality of what is motivating people's skepticism and engage with that, and maybe you can preempt it, and that raises credibility. One of the recommendations was also to be a little bit less ideological in general with their communications, not necessarily with their activities, but to just give facts, let people come to their own conclusions where possible. One of the other spin-off ideas I heard people talking about when I went to do some follow-up conversations because of the articles we were writing was that they're considering developing a whole message bank, kind of like what we started testing in the survey, and working together to say, well, there's a bunch of ideas, each one can pick or choose these messages. I would love to do that if we had ongoing research. Without ongoing research, again, it's all kind of shot in the dark. And then reaching out to mainstream media as opposed to just gravitating towards places where you can easily get published, like the more liberal and left-wing media. Even though I do write for one of those far liberal and left-wing media. And then I say et cetera because I feel like it's an ongoing thought process. In other words, they have continued to think about this stuff, not necessarily in a structured way, some more, some less, but the fact that ideas are out there and they're coming up with new ideas, even when I haven't been in contact with them, I think is, to my mind, an auspicious sign of where things should go. And that's it. I'm happy to take questions.
I knew that Dahlia, that I would learn a ton from Dahlia, and I just did. And I wish we could have this conversation every day, all the time, because I think this is where we need to move in that direction. Being very systematic, methodological, methodical about it. Being committed to our principles, but doing so in a way that's smart and data-driven. So, Dahlia, thank you. Next, I'd like to invite Emily Martinez to speak. Emily is in charge of the Human Rights Initiative at the Open Society Foundation. I probably don't need to explain what Open Society is, but for those of you who might have been confused by all the acronyms, there's only two really big private foundations that support human rights in the U.S. And the Open Society Foundation, built on the wealth of George Soros, is the most important, or the second most important, along with Ford. And Emily is in charge of everything that they do that's human rights related. And her team is about 30 or 40 people all over the world. And so she's we all say, we have an idea, we wish the donors would be interested. Well, this is that moment. The donor is here, and and I know she's interested because we've had these conversations already, and I know this is something that she finds intriguing, and I'm excited to hear more thoughts.
Excellent, thank you very much. I need my notes, so I might either stand up there or sit down. What are people's preferences? Stand. Okay, well, I'll try standing. I can't then see what you're seeing, but perfect. Okay. Perfect, thanks. So first I wanted to thank you for having me, because donors don't often get invited to these kinds of meetings, so it's fun. And in particular, I wanted to thank you because, as you know, Jim, this is something that we are beginning to get into, and I think what we realize is we certainly are learning what we don't know, and it's a very new field for us. And so you'll forgive me if some of my presentation lumbers along a bit, because I think you'll get a sense of what we're trying to grapple with. And I also am going to ask for your forgiveness for one more reason, which is that I stretched the meaning a little bit of my presentation, and I'm looking beyond just surveys to include other kinds of attitude data. So, we, as a program, the Human Rights Initiative was established in 2013, and one of the first tasks we had to do was to figure out what our strategy was going to be going forward, which is always a fun thing to do with a big foundation when you're in a moment of transition. And I think fundamentally we see ourselves as a program that is about bolstering the human rights movement and supporting that movement to take on the challenges that it's facing. And at the time, and it really continues to this day, we couldn't help but noticing that many of our partners and peers really felt like they were under attack. And I just went back to 2013 to pull some of the headlines from the day that we were grappling with. The UK repealing the Human Rights Act was obviously one of them, and lots of sort of wacky data suggesting that people in Britain supported that, and they'll talk about that later, I'm hoping. But also in Russia, this was the year the Foreign Agents Law started rolling out, and the law itself was particularly worrying, but I think what was so surprising to us, this is about Memorial, which is one of the oldest human rights groups in Russia, was how quickly those labels stuck to the NGOs. So, I mean, it wasn't surprising that Putin was calling human rights activists foreign agents. What was surprising is it was kind of widely taken up, and that there wasn't more debate within society about that. I think we also saw that there's closing space. I'm not talking to my usual crowd, so forgive me if I brush over things that you all are not as familiar with, but over the last 3 years, we've seen over 100 laws around the world limiting the space for activism, pushing back on human rights groups as well as other groups, and they were going after things like funding. They were using smear campaigns that got at the fact that these groups may or may not represent any constituency in these places. Some of these smear campaigns got very personal. And they also prevented a lot of obstacles for how organizations were running. And so we started thinking about what can we do to help foster the resilience in the movement. And what it came down to was this idea that, essentially a lot of the human rights groups in many places where we were working needed to have the resources to sort of understand how to build up their base of support, how to potentially tap into other forms of philanthropy besides foreign foundations, as well as how to identify allies. And so that's what got us into this space. And I should say, as much as we didn't know that we were entering this space when we started, I think our human rights NGO partners were also similarly not sure about the ground they were taking. And so I'm going to give you two examples, one from Brazil, and I'm sorry, but it's not a Connectus example, but I had to be familiar with it, it's from criminal justice, and one from our disability work. So I'm not changing the page. So in 2009 or so, this is from the Connectus website, so I stole it, sorry. In 2009, we started doing a lot of focused work on criminal justice in Brazil, leading funding groups like Connectus, but also a range of other groups. And that ended up with a network of about, I'd say somewhere between up to a dozen organizations that we were supporting to look at the issue of pretrial detention. And they were doing most of the normal things that human rights groups do. They were doing litigation, they were doing legislative advocacy, they were doing a lot of reporting. And one of the big issues that started to emerge for a lot of our groups was that there was a really tight link between the numbers driving detention, particularly pretrial detention, and drug policy in Brazil. And so these are just examples of a couple of reports capturing some of that experience. Basically, in Sao Paulo, the groups found that roughly 70% of the drug-related cases ended up having people remanded to custody. And this was as opposed to 53% for violent crimes, as opposed to 10% for non-violent crimes. And in Sao Paulo, the numbers were even, in Rio, the numbers were even worse. Close to 98% of all people accused of drug-related offenses were remanded to custody. And so we had great data. There was a lot of work to try and take some of the data collected from these studies and to create a public sense of outrage, because as you know, criminal justice and politics often go together, and there's a lot of rhetoric that's about being tough on crime. I don't know how successful that was, but one grantee of ours, the Center for Studies of Public Security and Citizenship, CIDE, in Rio, decided to actually understand what exactly the opposition was. So this is just one slide. I put the link down at the bottom, and I'm happy to share with anybody to the full study. They basically ran through a whole bunch of surveys. They did, I think, up to 13 focus groups, surveyed about 2,000 residents in 13 different in-depth interviews in order to really understand what was the public in Rio feeling about regulating drugs, and decriminalizing drugs. And I think while the results affirmed much of what the organization thought they were going to get, which was that most people supported regulation of drugs, that they were very uncomfortable with decrim, and that this cut across economic and social strata. I think what they learned as a result of this was that they needed to be doing more to respond to some of the emotions that were causing these feelings. Because one of the things that came out in a lot of the focal groups was that people felt very passionately about these issues. There was a lot of emotion and fear connected to it, and that they were kind of deep-held beliefs. And so one of our grantees, and so this is to talk a little bit about sort of what they did with it, she then decided to run to hire some of the animators in the country to do basically a series of pretty strong, emotive cartoons that were put on public buses. 40 public buses in Rio, and I don't know what the number was in Sao Paulo, and it created a lot of media attention, some positive, some negative, a lot of mixed. In Sao Paulo, interesting, the local government decided to pull them off the buses, and so then there was a very public debate about that decision, and my colleague joked that in fact they ended up having reverse effect, which was they created even more. But to me, this was a great example of a group using surveys and focal groups and trying to get at that data, and then thinking of a strategy that frankly is really, this is an academic center at a university that was pretty far away from what this community of human rights groups had been doing. And this was just an example that most of the victims of the war on drugs